Republicans dead.
Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay?
The women with the least likelihood of getting pregnant are the ones most worried about having abortions.
On January 6th of 2021, you had tens of thousands of people peacefully protesting.
So, it's not a right-wing conspiracy theory. It's not QAnon. It's real.
Our guest today on the enemies list is Ryan J. Reilly. Ryan is an NBC News justice reporter, the author of Sedition Hunters, How January 6th Broke the Justice System, and a guy who is tied into Washington, D.C. and knows what the heck is going on at a level of granularity like very few other folks in the media. And so I'm honored to have Ryan with me today. And I wanted to start off, Ryan, in the last couple of days, we have seen the House of Representatives name as their speaker a guy who was an essential part of the insurrectionist ideal that led to January 6th. How does that shape the perception of what happened that day? What do you think it means for the Congress, and what do you think it means for the people that are still in the justice system paying the price for having violently attacked the Capitol?
There's the thing we go back and forth on every time is trying to figure out whether someone actually believes it or whether they're just doing it for political expediency. And that's the core of a lot of this for me. You see it with, the lies about the stolen election, as well as I think this whole notion of the FBI set up January 6th that a lot of, now we've seen on the right that has been really taken up. And it's really tough to figure out sometimes because you really don't. He was very deeply involved with a lot of the legal efforts, and I think he's a smart guy. It's tough to figure out where he actually falls, because if you just examine some of these claims about the election, they sort of fall apart on their face, and they're ridiculous, right? Like a lot of the affidavits that they were putting forward at the time in 2020 were just like insane. One thing I didn't realize until I sort of started working on the book and going through a lot of these FOIA documents were, Melissa Carone, she was this individual who was sort of parodied on SNL, and was just, her testimony was just openly ridiculous, and it was funny that anyone would take that seriously. But that was something that Mark Meadows was sending up to the Attorney General of the United States after the election, sending along that Carone affidavit. And that's the quality of stuff, that the garbage that they were feeding in to the Justice Department beforehand. So, you never really know with a lot of these people what they at their core believe in a lot of instances, whether or not they actually, think the election was stolen, or whether they're just saying that because that's what their voters believe.
Yeah, I mean, my back of the envelope is that probably 20% of them actually believe it was stolen, and the rest are just scared to cross the line with Trump or the base or Fox or however you look at it. So you mentioned one of the ancillary big lies of the big lie that the election was stolen was that somehow Ray Epps and the secretive FBI engineered January 6th, and that they created this gigantic conspiracy that was meant to, quote, make Trump look bad. Talk to me a little bit about what's the origin story of that lie, and remind our viewers how easily debunked it is.
Sure, I can lean into Ray Epps a little bit, but I think broader picture, one thing that really just jumps out at me, and I fundamentally, there's a disconnect for me, is that traditionally all my life, conservatism and all of my friends and family who are conservative, it's been about the government is ineffective and the private sector is much more effective. And for some reason, in the case of January 6th, all of that just seems to go out the window, and they think the smartest people in the universe are working for the FBI. Set aside whether or not you think the FBI, just set aside whether or not they're actually just that evil and that's what they're doing, but just competency. Imagine pulling off this massive crime across several states, or setting this up and just leaving no traces. That would be a super genius move. You would have to have the best operators possible. And the reality of the FBI is just a lot different, I think, from the Hollywood image. And that's sort of an ongoing theme of the book, where it really is just a lot of bureaucracy. And, I make the joke, it's more The Office than CSI, right?
Sure.
Their technology is really just behind the private sector, the sleuths who are doing this outside of government and not dealing with the inside of bureaucracy. And I hear all of these things the FBI was manipulating this behind the scenes. And then I'm reading thousands of pages of FBI email, and it's sent from my Samsung email, and like, sorry for the formatting, mess up. Like, oh, I have a word. It's just like the basic sort of everyday drudgery that you would expect of a bureaucracy. And that's what a lot of this is. But they think they're these master manipulators. And because they can't get that messaging out, I think that's unfortunately gone to the broader public. But, with Ray Epps specifically, basically, this was a guy who was recorded the night before January 6th saying, we should go in the Capitol. He's ultimately charged now, which just the fact that he's charged completely obliterates any suggestion that he was a Fed. Imagine if you were working for the federal government and then, hey, man, you might have to go to jail just to maintain your cover. It's fundamentally doesn't work. But there's this ongoing thing where no one seems to be able to take the L and like admit defeat in this case, where they just can't say like, oh no, this was really dumb, I was wrong, because it's deeply embarrassing for anyone who put forward that suggestion that now he's charged and that is completely debunked, but no one's admitting that they were just wrong and were putting out garbage out there because they didn't understand the fundamentals of how all of this worked and picked up pieces of information. But there's not an admission of guilt at any point in terms of like, I was wrong, this was ridiculous. And even though there's numerous people like Ray Epps who everyone was like, this is the linchpin, this is that person, and then oh, this is Antifa, this is an undercover Fed, and then lo and behold, just another Trump supporter who thought the election was stolen. Like every time, it just works like magic.
I'm wondering how many of these people, and you followed the cases, and I tend to go down the rabbit hole when you post these stories about these people who had this one shining moment where they were going to charge the Capitol, and now 2.5 years later, the justice system is like, no, sir, you in fact went in and attacked this cop, or you broke this thing, or you charged through this broken window, or whatever. Are these people? Are any of them? I know one of them. There's one older lady, the MAGA granny. She came on a Twitter threads with me a couple weeks ago, and was like so heartbroken that she got so tricked. Are many of these people like realizing this, or a lot of them still pretty defiant about it? Like
it's tough.
They were taken.
I don't know if I don't know if I want to break it down to percentage, but there's definitely a mix in terms of how they feel. And it's sometimes also tough to feel, to tell what they really feel. And it's so interesting because, when it gets to that point, when it gets to the point where you're pleading guilty or you're being sentenced, obviously some of these lives have really been, ruined or torn apart, or this has at least significantly affected their lives. And it's so mixed together, this idea of being apologetic with whether you still believe that the election was stolen. And, to a certain extent, if I try to put myself in other people's shoes, it's always a good experiment. And if I still thought the election was stolen, what would I be sorry for? As long as I didn't do any, like, sure, you might separate it out, like, oh, I think the election was stolen, but sure, I shouldn't have assaulted that cop. Fine. But like, fundamentally, if you still think the election is stolen, then, well, there's the world's greatest criminal is in the White House right now, and I'm getting my life torn apart because I walked into a building, with a sign or something, and like, right. So I kind of understand that, but it just becomes this weird space where judges shouldn't and can't be like, do you still think the election was stolen? There's not like a litmus test on what their belief about the election is, but it's so tied together because it really doesn't make sense why you would be apologetic for something if you still fundamentally believe that the election was stolen and that, there's a usurper in the White House and that all of this is illegal,
Yeah.
So it's interesting to see how that all plays out.
Yeah, I mean that really does require you have to believe that we are under an occupied government with a usurper who is politically illegitimate in the White House. And I mean, even these people at some point, I feel like, at least sort of intuitively, that a few of them are doing this because they want to try to minimize their sentences, but a few of them have realized like, oh my gosh, this was never real. I got, I whether you take it at their very best of I got caught up in the moment, or you take it at the worst of I got busted. A lot of them seem to be, or not a lot, but a number of them seem to be like, oh my God, there wasn't going to be a revolution that day. There wasn't a legal pathway to sort this out. But speaking of the legal pathway question, Mike Johnson was part of that, fairly smart group of constitutional lawyers who in the House were part of trying to put together a legal predicate for overturning the 2020 election. In your reporting, do you have a sense of where he was in that sort of hierarchy? I know there were a lot of Republican lawyers, and I know like Mike Lee and others were having these phone calls with the White House. Was Johnson a part of that level of that sort of legal infrastructure to try to overturn the election?
Not that he wasn't one of the big figures who necessarily
Okay.
popped on my radar in terms of the being in communication with the Justice Department directly or that sort of thing. But he was obviously involved in this sort of legal argument. And I think that's what we saw. I'm blanking on his name now, but the congressman who was talking about this idea that didn't think we should get someone who was an election denier really in the speakerhood, and then flipped on it and then said, oh, okay, well in this case, he was basically making these legal arguments. And I think they sort of make that distinction between whether they're just doing this legally or whether they are summoning people to the Capitol. But I was looking back. I sort of actually, when he was elected yesterday, I went back in and went to the slews and was like, okay, hey, where does he pop up on the radar? And he was calling into Fox News on January 6th during the Capitol attack itself, and was like on a phoner with them while he was off in hiding. And it just seems like such an obvious, and that's part of the thing too, that the FBI just really should have seen this coming. And I think that the FBI has gotten a pass largely, especially from the January 6th committee, while they did a tremendous job of focusing all of this attention on Donald Trump. I think that they were worried that it was going to complicate the narrative if you brought in sort of the law enforcement angle and what the FBI mistakes that were made here, which I think is important. I've lost my train of thought.
It's okay.
Yeah. But
it's been a long week.
It has been a very long week. I think it is interesting to see these figures now are in these prominent positions, and a reporter got booed when they were asking them what they sort of felt about the election. And it's this really important thing because we're going to have another election. Like, spoiler alert, Donald Trump is going to be the Republican nominee.
Shocker.
And no matter what happens, I actually think there's, he has a very good chance of this in the polling. I think that, this is by no means going to be a blowout against Donald Trump necessarily. But no matter what happens, I think he's going to claim he won. And what are we going to do that time? Right. And because there's just a situation where people believe this deep in their bones and in their hearts, something that is fundamentally untrue. And it was just so predictable coming up to January 6th that we didn't really, that we didn't predict what could have happened when people believed a crazy conspiracy theory.
It's ironic. Reed Galen and Stuart Stevens and I wrote an op-ed, I think in October, and we asked our Republican colleagues, what are you going to do if Trump denies the election? You're going to cross that Rubicon with him if they go to violence? And we wrote it then, put it away, and then January 6th, when it started happening, all of us were like, oh my God. But even even a guy like me, I've got a pretty dark view of what Trump's capable of. Even I was like on January 6th, like, good God, I can't believe what I'm watching. So speaking of Trump, who is the sort of prime mover and centerpiece of all the things underneath this chaos for these people, he's having a pretty rough week, legally speaking. He's been getting reprimanded from the judge. He's been storming out of the courtroom. He's had a bunch of his folks flip in the Georgia case, and more in the offing, apparently. Give us your sort of 30,000 foot view of where he stands in both the New York and the Georgia legal wrangles right now, because they seem to be getting a little more intense than even I anticipated for him.
Yeah, when it's my full-time job to cover all of these cases, and even I have trouble. I have trouble keeping up with it. So I really kind of worry sometimes with the general public whether this is going to break through, because just even casual conversations with friends who are much more usually typically read in than probably your average American to what's going on. It's like, which case is this again and what's happening here? It's just like there's so much chaos that it's hard to sort of keep track of. I do think that it seems like timeline wise, when I just set this out on a map, and I sort of think of this selfishly too, because I'm the DOJ reporter in DC, and the Jack Smith case is the first one that I'm going, the main one that I'm focused on. But it seems like that is going to be the lead definitive case, and I think that that's important because as important as the documents cases out of Florida, I think that's going to get kicked down the road. There's some complicated issues there. Also, obviously, a Trump appointed judge,
and a bad jury pool. Yes,
the jury pool as well. But jury pools can surprise you. I would say it's sometimes the voir dire process does sometimes sort some of those things out in the mix. And there have been January 6 cases where, despite the makeup of DC, defendants have been acquitted on certain charges. Like, they really have followed the evidence. I mean, the evidence is so overwhelming that it's not as though there will be people getting off the hook completely. But specific charges, a number of cases have been dismissed. But I think that the Jack Smith case in DC really is kind of the definitive one that this is really building around. And I also think that, Judge Chuckin isn't going to put up with too much there. And while there might be some slight slippage on the date, I do think that March date is probably going to hold relatively firm, and it's coming up so quickly. And I mean, that's going to be something that is on the calendar and has a resolution long before the election. So really at that point, if this, as long as there are sort of no surprises, it does seem like it's going to be a circumstance where there's a pending conviction and potential sentencing going into the general election in a year from now. And I mean, if you follow it out and you just like put this on the calendar, okay, March, say, give it, April, even if it's end of April or something, you end in a resolution there. It's usually 3 months out from when you actually impose the sentences in these cases. Right. That's probably not going to hold, but like it seems like, there might be a pending, a pending sentencing against the, sitting Republican nominee.
And the weird thing about it is, we've been doing a lot of polling on it, and Republican voters don't care. They don't care. It does not.
But it is very, it's so intertwined now that it's almost like the legal strategy is the political strategy. I just think it's like, that's what it is. Like, right. He's running because that's going to bust all of this open. Otherwise this would just be, dealt with in a much, much different way. But that's not where his sort of incentives are.
I think that's a really good observation that the legal and the political are absolutely running, if not even on parallel tracks, in an intertwined way, because and I think he's been playing chicken with DOJ, and once he has the nomination, I think that and there's a rumor going around right now that the RNC is going to basically, after the first 3 primaries, just declare him the nominee, like get way ahead of the August convention date, and so he has that status at that moment as part of a legal defense, which I think would be, it's novel. I don't know if it really changes the legal side of it in any meaningful way, but I think it does that, the public perception. And I do worry about DOJ and OLC saying, well, now he's the nominee and it's public perception of that's a fear I have that I can't quite shake, honestly.
Yeah. So many of these rules, I do think that the system wasn't built for this sort of situation in just so many ways, where you're like, oh, this is not kind of the norm. And you sometimes see like a little bit of breakage, like I think of Chris Wray a lot with this. Chris Wray is someone who, I mean, let's remember here, a Republican, lifelong Republican. And like, it's just very interesting when you finally have him snap at one of these hearings, not snap, but point out the ridiculousness of what's being alleged. Like, oh, you were biased against conservatives. And it's just like, it's a head scratcher for a moment. He's like, considering my own personal history, I don't know if that makes a ton of sense. But
and have you met the FBI senior leadership?
Yes. Like Republicans all the way down. Like, it's,
it's good Irish Catholic Republicans from Boston. Yes. I mean, come on, people.
Yeah, but that's, I mean, it's very surprising when we have, you go back even, 8 years now, right? And you would just say, like, oh, hey, the Republican Party thinks that the FBI, yes, that FBI is super biased against Republicans, and it's just a real head scratcher. Meanwhile, there's a sitting member of the Senate, a Democrat, who is under indictment for alleged crime. So it just like doesn't check out this whole idea. And also Hunter Biden was charged. It just doesn't make this, if the deep state is pulling the strings behind here, they're not doing a great job.
As I always just say, if the deep state is as powerful as you think it is, and as whatever it is, nobody's showing up for work because it's really letting a lot of things slip. So in the Georgia case, you've got Jenna Ellis, and you've got Cheeseborough, and you've got this seemingly another long list of other folks that were indicted along with him. They're all starting to flip and starting to turn. I think Rudy will be the last, but what do you think the impact of that is on not only on Trump's legal strategy and his psychology, but on where that affects like Trump's current lawyers. If I'm a Trump attorney right now, I've got to be like, ooh, I better watch my step, because
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah, and not make arguments, bad faith arguments. I think is a big
Mm,
component of that. It is just such a juxtaposition because I think a lot of people just saw sort of the individuals who were signing up and just saw it as openly ridiculous. And I think as Bill Barr even described it, a clown car of attorneys. It was
right.
just not people who were really all that relevant, or it was people who were trying to gain some relevancy, or were sort of like out of the game and wanted to sort of jump back in. I mean, Rudy Giuliani, top of the list, sort of there. Also, obviously had some financial ongoing issues.
Deeply bad financial situation.
Yeah, and was not getting paid apparently by was upset about that and trying, but I listened. I remember listening to the one argument, and it was like it's during, I think it was a Pennsylvania case where Rudy's arguing he's in court for the first time in like
Right.
30 years, and the judge comes up in a question about strict scrutiny, which is like a first year of law school
Sure.
sort of question, and he just he's like, and what level, the judge was like, what level of scrutiny should I be applying here, and he just goes, the normal one. It was just like this.
No, but
you're not sending your best.
You're right though. I mean, Rudy, because I worked for Rudy in the 90s, late 90s, early 2000s, and he had not been in a courtroom. He had one court case, but he was of counsel, but he was not the lead guy in the courtroom for Activision, like in the mid 2000s. But it was one of these like business law things. It was incredibly not Rudy's lane, but he was the rainmaker on the case, whatever. But no, he had not been in a courtroom in a very long time.
Yeah,
and which
and it showed. It showed.
And what did they lose? Not just Rudy, but the Trump legal effort to overturn this. They lost 60 plus cases in the course of the year in which they litigated all this stuff, right?
And that case in particular was just like the judge was pretty straightforward about what was happening there, I think, in his final opinion, and was like they were trying to disenfranchise millions of people. And I think sometimes we get like lost at like what the actual goal was there, and the goal was to disenfranchise entire states, including like that was the end goal. This wasn't to do a recount. This wasn't to figure out some way that we could take out votes that we didn't like, because that wasn't a possibility. It was just they wanted to obliterate the entire state electoral. Like they wanted to get rid of those electoral college votes and not have them count. And that's definitively
as one of them told an associate of mine back at the moment, I tweeted about it when it happened. They really wanted to knock out Pennsylvania in particular, because there was a upsurge in African American turnout from where Hillary had been in the Philly suburbs, and I knew about the program because Lincoln Project funded it to turn those people out, and they basically were like, "Well, we're going to try to take these million African American voters in Pennsylvania off the table," and it's just, it was really, I mean, I'm not an attorney, but it was so constitutionally pernicious that I can't imagine I guess lawyers always defend their clients zealously, but in that case, it would be a hard lift to say, wow, I'm going to go in and try to overturn an election, but basically going to be in the states where African American turnout was above average.
Yeah.
And I mean, just a really unbelievably dark idea. But
yeah, I'm from the Philly area, so that's somewhere I really focused on. And when you just like look at like I don't think like I think some people recognize, but probably should be broader, is that like he did better in Philly and Detroit. Trump did better in Philly and Detroit than he did in 2016, and like it just doesn't make sense what they were sort of suggesting here, because he performed better. Like there are parts of Philly, Northeast Philly, around Four Seasons landscaping,
total landscaping,
right? Across from the crematorium and next to the sex shop, that went for Trump. There were one parts of Philly, and I think that is what people. It's so ingrained, and I think there is like a much longer history of that within the Republican Party in terms of just like focusing on,
Sure.
urban voting, as they sort of say. And, he definitely, really leaned into these it's that, you didn't build that sort of thing, right? Like Trump took advantage of this thing that was already this major strain, I think, within the Republican Party about voter turnout in cities, right?
Right.
Wink, wink, nudge, nudge, and really leaned into that hard. And you saw that with, Rudy Giuliani saying, for example, two innocent women who were volunteering for their elections were passing along what he claimed was a USB drive, and just says it's like it was a vial of crack. Like it's
Right.
like it's not even a dog whistle in those.
No, it's a
in those
dog
cases.
air raid siren in that
Yeah.
case. And yeah, the Ruby Freeman in that particular case, I think when they testified during the January 6th hearings, I think people were really sort of stunned, like these were not some sort of, again, like you were saying, they're not part of like this sophisticated deep state conspiracy. They're volunteers who are trying to do
Yes.
good, like do their civic duty, and
Yeah.
then they're turned into targets. Which I think there's a part of our political culture that has become very comfortable with much more directly targeting individuals with whom you disagree politically. But in this era of the mob culture and social media culture, people like that are really put at risk.
Yeah.
And
It's completely true. Yeah.
And just as I pointed out to somebody, the bravest people on 1-6 were, aside from the police officers, were those two young women who were carrying out the certified election result cases and got them away from the mob. I mean, that was a moment where people underestimate how close we came to a more fundamental collapse in the country, I think, than almost anybody has realized at the time.
But, and one thing that just didn't, even for me, like in the lead up to January 6th itself, I didn't recognize until I really worked on the book just how intertwined a lot of that interference from the Oval Office had been with the preparations for January 6th. Because if you think about that big, knockdown, drag out fight where at the White House, where all these Justice Department officials were going to quit, that was on Sunday, and you're coming off of like basically the vacation time, and that no one's firing on all cylinders, let alone federal bureaucracy, in the final 2 weeks of December. And there was also an attack that took place in Nashville. They were very distracted at this point, and then you had a situation where they also lost access to one of their social media monitoring tools. It was just a sort of like perfect storm of events that ended up leading to them not being able to prepare, because they thought the acting deputy attorney general started taking things off of his walls on Sunday because he thought he was going to be fired. So you might say that the Justice Department was a bit distracted in the lead up to January 6th.
Right. It certainly is something that is, I think, marked our country in a way that it hasn't fully worked its way through the system yet. And it's going to be a long time until it does. But until then, folks, Ryan Reilly is, again, the NBC Justice reporter. He understands these things. Follow him on social media. It is Ryan J. Reilly, correct?
That's right. Yeah.
All right.
Pick up Sedition Hunters wherever books are sold.
Right. And Sedition Hunters, wherever fine books are sold, it is on all the places. It is a cracking good read, and it will give you an insight into the scope of what happened on that terrible day. Ryan, thank you so much for joining us on the Enemies List today. I really appreciate it. We look forward to having you back again.
Thanks so much.
The problem solver Republicans and the Biden 18 Republicans, every single one of them, we've talked about this before, but I'm just going to do it again. Every single one of them voted for Mike Johnson, the most extreme person in the contention for speaker in modern history. This guy makes Newt Gingrich look like Ted Kennedy. This guy is so far out there, and every single one of them voted for him. He's an insurrectionist. He is a part of the conspiracy to overthrow the legal count of the vote in 2020. He is, and I don't care where you stand on the subject of abortion, he believes in a national abortion ban for everything at all times. He also wants to unwind gay marriage. He also wants to make gay sex illegal. This is a guy who is way out there. And for all of you who want to pretend that you're moderates and centrists and do-gooders and problem solvers, none of you get to play that fucking game anymore. None of you. Not one of you. Okay? Not one of you get to play that game anymore. It's over. It's over. You are just as completely corrupt and completely depraved as Jim Jordan and Mike Johnson and Matt Gaetz and Lauren Boebert and the rest of them, you get to wear the red A of assholes, and you are on the enemies list.